Well, first off, congrats on
Thank
the film. So just wanted to start by asking kind of how the project came across your desk and what you enjoyed about reading the script for the first time.
I mean, the script was, when you think of Churchill, you think of all sorts of greatness and what have you, and the script wasn't that. It was about exploring the human being behind that, and that fascinated me, because I think, you know, there's plenty of things out there about all the great achievements. As a filmmaker, I thought it was a really interesting little, very concise, very personal, very intimate little portrait. And that's really what attracted me to it. I thought it was very well written. We did a lot of work to take the film from an interior film to put probably half the film outside, because I also felt what was interesting about the screenplay was really about isolation on a number of levels, and it was about. So you think of the sort of these big themes of intimacy and isolation, they're kind of contradictory, and so visually and thematically we did a lot of work on trying to make that part of the story we were telling, because I think they really reflected. As the more I talked to Alex, the more I talked and read stuff about Churchill, this was a time that lead up to D-Day, he was a very isolated character, both in terms of world leaders and running the war. You know, the Americans had come into the war. Eisenhower had taken over, leading the Allied effort. Churchill had been marginalised to a degree, and his influence wasn't what it was 4 years earlier when he was leading Britain through the Blitz. And so that, to me, how does someone who's gone to the top find relevance and find a purpose and find the will and the care to keep going once all those accoutrements of power have been taken away from him? And that's a fascinating story, I think. And what I liked about it was that it explored that. And that's what really attracted me to it, I guess.
I think the thing with Churchill, for me personally, I know certain things about him, but there's always things, even over these years, that you discover more and more about him and his private moments and his public moments. Was that something for you when you were researching it and everything else that you found
very much
more
so
about him?
Well, as I've said to many people, I'm Australian, so my relationship with Churchill is very different, because Gallipoli is a huge, probably the most preeminent moment in our nation's history in many ways, for good and bad. And Churchill, as one of the grand planners and designers and instigators of the Gallipoli campaign, as he articulates in the film, has a very resonating sort of sense for Australians. And so to come to a film where he talked about his guilt and his shame and his concern of repeating those mistakes, seeing it in a sense, holding his hand up to those mistakes, which is something you so rarely see in politicians, but at the same time, not wanting to take the responsibility, not wanting to repeat the sending of young people off to war with such abandon and such lack of kind of understanding of the sacrifice that is, I thought was an amazing thing. And to learn about him, that after what happened to him at the end of the First World War, that he actually went off and fought in the front lines, it equipped him to have those kind of, to look back at what he'd done and try and change the way he went about it. Because it wasn't just Gallipoli, it was Dunkirk and all sorts of beach-type landings where everyone was so vulnerable and the loss of life was massive, and he just didn't want to be part of something that was just going to repeat what he knew to be wrong in his eyes. And D-Day is looked at as this sort of, as the defining sort of moment to the end of the Second World War. But people forget it was a success eventually, and as we look back, but it still took a year to finish the war. And a lot of loss of life took place as a result of that. And what was great for me was to see someone who had regret, who had I think a sincere, and this is one of the things I really took from the experience, he had a great sincerity in his love of and connection with the everyday man and woman. He used to go out into the streets after, a day after the Blitz and hug people and burst into tears, an incredibly un-British reaction. He was emotional, and yet, and he let that emotion, he wore that emotion a lot on his sleeve, and that was kind of a fascinating thing. And his ability to in a sense understand what the sacrifice was, but to also try to lead and give, as Clemmy says to him in that sort of penultimate scene, to give people hope, to make people understand that their loved ones or they have not been killed in vain, and that every life is worth something. And I think that's for all the mistakes and all the foibles, that only makes him a greater human being in understanding that.
Let me ask you about Brian Cox, because obviously a few people have played him over the years.
Yeah.
And I'd read the two things that fascinated me. One is that he didn't want to wear the prosthetics. He wanted to put the weight on and make sure he kind of fully went into the character. Also, the strange thing I read that I don't know if it's true or not, but he saw a clip of Stewie Griffin and Family Guy and kind of not based it, but a little bit kind of tweaked in his head. Yeah. Did he kind of talk to you about all those things beforehand?
A little bit. I mean, he's been preparing this role for a long, long time. Even before the film was there, in a way. There was apparently 20 years ago, there was a project that might have happened, didn't. And he's obviously been thinking about it a lot. And we talked a lot about all those things that you've just mentioned and about, where to pitch it. And that there is an element, just because of the sort of concertinaed, intimate nature of the film, there's a certain Shakespearean quality to it, and that I didn't want to lose that. And I thought that was kind of an interesting challenge as well. Like when he praised for bad weather, I thought we tried it in lots of different ways, but it just never felt right unless it became this almost Shakespearean moment, rightly or wrongly. But what that really is about, though, is about a man breaking free of the things that shackle him. His depression, his alcoholism, his fear of the past, the fear of repeating mistakes, and expressing something that he feels deeply about. And I think when a film does that, it's an amazing, transcendent experience for the audience. And doing it with Brian was an amazing experience. It really was.
Yeah, he gives a great performance in this as well. Thanks so much for your time. Congratulations on the film.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're watching Hey You Guys.
Hey You Guys, huh?
Hey You Guys.
Is that from the Goonies?
It is indeed, yes.
Nice.
Hey